Now, having said that, I need to back up a little bit. We got about halfway through 15 compelling reasons why we explain the meaning of the Scripture. But as I was thinking about that, I realized that maybe we need to back up before we do the last half of our little list and make something very clear. And it is simply this: the meaning of Scripture can be known. It occurred to me sometime early in the week that there might be some of you saying, well, are we sure that we can actually get the meaning right? There are so many interpretations of the Scripture, and you hear this all the time. I was just reading an article this week in a national Christian periodical that basically conveyed the idea that getting to the meaning of Scripture is very difficult, and that reading the Bible may lead you to reject the things you've always believed, because all of a sudden you're going to see it in a new light, and it's going to take on new meaning, and experiences are going to happen, and intuitive elements are going to rise up, and you may find yourself having your theology changed by reading the Bible and seeing in it something you never really knew was there. Now, that raises the question that is often raised by people who are critical of any strong doctrine or any strong convictions, and they say, well, what makes you think you can know what the Bible means when there are so many people who take differing views? In fact, that has actually become a kind of hermeneutic. Hermeneutics is the science of Bible interpretation, and this is called the hermeneutics of humility. And the hermeneutics of humility says, I am far too humble to tell you I know what the Bible means by what it says. And actually, the assumption is that anybody who tells you they know what the Bible means is nothing short of arrogant, because we really can't know. Now, this would certainly be the position of the Roman Catholic Church, that no person or persons outside the triumphal realm of those who run the Catholic system could ever hope to understand what the Bible means. The Bible, for the run-of-the-mill folks, is unclear, says the Roman Catholic Church. It's impossible for them to interpret. Consequently, the Catholic Church did everything it could for 1,000 years to keep the Bible out of the hands of the people, because they didn't have what it took to be able to interpret it. The Catholic Church said, and still says, the only interpreter of Scripture is the infallible Church. Only the infallible Church can interpret Scripture. So you have the unenlightened masses completely incapable of interpreting the Bible, so what you must do is keep it out of their hands. Well, that didn't work. Once the Reformation came, the Bible was then placed in the hands of people. The question is, can we know what it means? By the way, as just a footnote to that, symbols develop, ceremonies develop, rituals develop in direct proportion to the obscurity of understanding the Scripture. So when you look at the Roman Catholic Church and you see all of the symbols, all of the rituals, all the ceremonies, it is in direct proportion to the obscurity of the meaning of Scripture in the minds of people. You don't tell them what it means, you give them symbols. Always they are in direct, sort of reverse proportion. The less the understanding, the more the symbols. You expect that in the Roman Catholic system. You don't expect that in the evangelical church. Received a letter this week from a man who wrote me to thank me for my ministry and tell me he prays for me, and I appreciate that. This is a man who said this, and I quote, "Certitude, when it comes to the Bible, is idolatrous. I have been forced to give up certitude. If there is a foundation in Christian theology, it is not found in Scripture. Theology must be a humble human attempt to hear God and never about rational approaches to texts." End quote. Certitude is idolatrous. We can't know what the Bible means. We can't draw theology out of Scripture. I've given up certitude. Approaching the Bible is never a rational exercise. Another popular emerging church leader said clarity is overrated. Shock and ambiguity often stimulate more thought than clarity. And another writer, Leslie Newbigin, says the gospel is not a matter of certainties. This is what's floating around in people's minds and leads to the conclusion that not only can we not know what the Bible means, it really doesn't matter because it might lead us to idolatry and to arrogance, and somehow we might not be nearly as stimulated as we would be with shock and ambiguity. You know, I don't think the New Testament is that hard to understand. I think part of the problem is we have so much bad interpretation over the last 2,000 years to muck up the waters of what is pretty clear. The first century Christians understood it, and they were largely Gentiles. They had no previous background in Christianity. They didn't come out of a Christian culture, Christian society. They had no prior understanding of Israel, no prior understanding of the Old Testament, the history of Israel, divine revelation in the Old Testament. And yet, the New Testament writers show absolutely no hesitancy in expecting the Gentile Christians to be able to read the Old Testament or a New Testament letter in their own language and get it. Think about the argument in Romans 4. Paul's writing to Romans, and they're Gentiles, and he makes this case in the 4th chapter about Abraham 2,000 years ago. The whole 4th chapter is a critical illustration of the reality of justification by faith alone as illustrated in the life of Abraham. The expectation was that they would fully understand it, fully grasp it. Paul writes to the Corinthians, and we all know what the Corinthians came out of, right? In the 10th chapter of 1 Corinthians, I was reading it just today, and he says, do you remember the story of the Exodus? And he goes all the way back to Moses, 1,500 years before. And you remember what happened to those people in the Exodus who decided to get a little overconfident and start to live on the edge of their liberty? You know what happened to them. They fell into idolatry. They fell into immorality. They fell into grumbling and complaining. They even fell into testing God. And guess what? They died. 3,000 of them, 23,000 of them, 70,000 of them. And these things, he says, have happened as examples unto us. You can understand that. That's not difficult to understand. Look, it is not arrogant to say you know what the Bible means. It is not arrogant. It is to be expected to know what the Bible means. Does that mean we can understand absolutely every nuance, every tiny detail, every interpretation of every obscure aspect of Scripture? No. No, even Peter said there were things about Paul that are hard to understand. Remember that? Peter said there's some things Paul wrote that are really hard to understand. And I will agree with you. There are some things hard to understand. But we know what those things are that are hard to understand. And I'm not talking about the things that are impossible to understand. That's another category, like the Trinity. You have to stop at some point and leave it alone, because you're not going to help yourself if you just keep chasing that inconceivable reality. But it is true that there are some things that are hard for us to fully understand. But please do not connect conviction about a true interpretation of Scripture with arrogance. And do not connect uncertainty with humility. That is ridiculous. We need humility where we need humility, but we don't need some kind of false humility that says, I'm so humble, I would never say what's true about the Bible. That's not humility, that's just stupidity. It was G.K. Chesterton, the a 20th century British writer who said, "What we suffer from today is humility in the wrong place." Yeah, that's not where you want your humility. Modesty has settled upon the organ of conviction where it was never meant to be. A man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth, and this has been reversed. Nowadays, the part of a man that a man does assert is exactly the part he ought not to assert, himself. The part he doubts is exactly the part he ought not to doubt, the divine revelation. And he goes on to say, we're on the road to producing a race of men too mentally modest to believe in the multiplication table. This is postmodernism. Actually, to deny the clarity and certainty of Scripture is not humility. It is arrogance of the worst kind. It is a kind of blasphemy that accuses God of having the inability to communicate what He wanted to say in a way that could be understood. Look, God holds people accountable with regard to their eternal destiny for their understanding of His revelation, both in nature and in Scripture. Is God unfair? Is this so obscure and ambiguous a revelation that God is unfair in holding men accountable for understanding it and rejecting it? I don't think so.